Undertale is a funny game because people will come out of it in awe at how well written and fleshed out all the characters are, and then have no clue if the main character even has a personality. Frisk is the main protagonist of Undertale, but it doesn't always feel that way. In works of fiction like this, the main character is typically the most popular and discussed, but with Undertale and Frisk, that is definitely not the case. To the point where I probably don't even need to say who Undertale's actual most popular character is. Don't get me wrong, it's not like Frisk is completely ignored. They still aren't that far down in terms of popularity, even if they aren't number one, and they still are the character you play as at the end of the day. It's pretty hard to forget about them entirely. Still though, I find that they're oddly overlooked in a way that no other character in this game is. Discussions around who Frisk really is as a character seem to be pretty rare or go under the radar in favor of analyzing other characters instead. It's gotten to a point where many people believe that their entire character is nothing more than a blank slate, which serves solely as a stand-in for the player. But despite their neutral expression and quiet nature, I can guarantee you that they are so much more than that. To be fair, this assumption isn't completely unfounded though, and I think that Toby actually tries to give you this wrong impression about Frisk at first. At the start and throughout much of the game, you can easily be fooled into thinking that they're just another typical self-insert RPG protagonist. They don't really have much dialogue outside of the options that we choose for them, their facial expression is always this blank one no matter what, and the name that we choose at the start seems to represent them in battle. But the thing is, just like how Undertale isn't your typical RPG, Frisk isn't your typical RPG hero either. This becomes really clear when you look at Kara, because Kara is that perfect self-insert RPG protagonist that we're led to believe Frisk is. Their speech at the end of Genocide shows that they're only focused on those classic RPG elements, like EXP, gold, level ups, grinding monsters, and becoming strong. And to really hammer it in, the name that we choose, the one that usually represents the self-insert in RPGs, isn't actually the name of the character we play as. Instead, it's Kara's. There's definitely more to Kara than just that, but it's clear that they're the one meant to be the analog for a regular RPG protagonist. So if Kara is supposed to be the typical RPG hero, well then who even is Frisk? Well, simply put, Frisk is Frisk. They aren't the player, they aren't a regular silent hero with no personality, they are their own person, just like any of the other characters. The ending of the True Passes route where Frisk, completely on their own, tells their name to Asriel always stuck out to me. This isn't the behavior of a normal self-insert main character. At the end of Pokemon, Red doesn't just go and announce that his name is Red. No, despite whatever canon name there is, the character you play as stays as just that. A character with your name that represents you. But this scene completely subverts that and makes a point to say that Frisk is Frisk, not the name you thought you gave them, and not just whoever you want them to be either. While we certainly do influence them, they are their own person with their own hopes, their own values, their own personality, and this moment establishes them as such. And if you need any more proof, look no further than what Flowey says to us after the ending. He asks us not to reset and to let Frisk live their life. He isn't talking to Frisk, he's talking to us, drawing a very clear line in the sand between the player and Frisk. But if Frisk and the player are separate, then who's making the decisions in-game? Who's really calling the shots, us or Frisk? Well, it's kind of a bit of both. Sure, we as the player can choose from different things for Frisk to do, but they'll still choose to go about things in their own way. Take for example choosing to heckle Snowdrake. As the player, we pick the option probably expecting nothing more than a simple boo or a tiny insult to come out of it. But what does Frisk do? Well, they tell them that they'll never be loved by anyone, of course. Suffice to say, Frisk does have their own free will, and even if we choose the things they do, they'll choose how to do it in ways that we don't dictate or have control over. We also have pretty solid evidence that they won't do things that they don't want to do either. In the snowy fight, we can also choose the heckle option, but Frisk will flat out not go through with it. There's also other more subtle cases of this, like the Toriel and Asgore fights, where you can choose to try and talk with them, but Frisk can just decide not to based on the circumstances. Another interesting case of Frisk's level of control over their own decisions is evidenced by their hatred for soda. Okay, please just trust me, I promise this is going somewhere. When we're hanging out with Undyne, we get to see that Frisk doesn't like soda based on their unhappy look if we decide to try and drink it, alongside the description of it being a sickly liquid. And when we go to Alphys' fridge with instant noodles and soda, even though the soda is explicitly mentioned, we're only given the choice to take the instant noodles, even though the soda would probably also be a useful healing item. To me, the only explanation for this is that Frisk saw the soda and ruled it out completely as an option, hence why we physically can't take it and never get the choice to. Because of moments like this, my interpretation of the options we're given is that these are all choices Frisk considers and is thinking of doing, and as the player, we point them in one direction or another. Now, admittedly, I realize that the logic in this scenario isn't completely rock solid, considering you still can choose the soda at Undyne's house. Regardless, I still think it's a pretty reasonable conclusion to make, especially with how explicit the mention of soda is in the fridge despite us not being able to take it, paired with the context of Frisk specifically not liking it. And I mean, after all, the options we're given have to come from someone, right? While we choose from the options available to us, Frisk is also the one giving us those options in the first place, so I like to think of it as kind of a team effort. On this note, I also felt like it was important to quickly debunk a popular rumor that Toby Fox once said that Frisk and many aspects about them are completely up to the player's interpretation or whatever the player wants them to be. To be completely clear, he has never said this. This quote simply just doesn't exist, which is pretty insane because I remember this rumor back from 2015, and I still see it getting brought up a whole decade later. Unfortunately, there are some people who say this just to get around using their pronouns of they, them. And while Frisk's gender has never been explicitly stated, it doesn't really make sense to refer to them as anything else when they're exclusively referred to with these pronouns in-game. Like I've hopefully made clear by now, Frisk is their own character and not just whoever the player wants them to be. Alright, so if Frisk is their own person, then who are they? What do we know about them? Well, a lot, actually. Even at the very beginning of the game, we can already tell that they're a very outdoorsy kid who likes to spend their time outside by the fact that Frisk starts out with a bandage and a stick. You certainly don't need a bandage from staying inside all day, and you obviously aren't gonna find any sticks inside either. I mean, come on, who didn't pick up a random stick and pretend it was a sword at least once during their childhood? Their playful and whimsical nature is continued to be shown throughout the game too, like how they crinkle through the leaves or do silly things to spare monsters like wiggling their arms at Whimsun and Moldsmall. There's also all of the choices that Frisk gives during the date with Alphys, which are really just great in their own right. It's funny because even the definition of the real-life word frisk means to playfully hop around. While they are adventurous and silly like most kids though, there's also much more to them than just that. One of the most prevalent and consistent aspects of Frisk's character is how they find meaning in a lot of different things, even when there isn't any particular meaning to begin with. This is seen in most of the save points, where they're filled with energy and determination, even if it's something quite mundane, like the wind blowing or even the smell of cobwebs. They don't have any inherent meaning to them, but Frisk finds meaning in them and becomes more determined because of it. They even find meaning in and are inspired by literal garbage, which is by definition worthless and meaningless. Some of the best examples of this are the recurring save points located next to a mouse hole and some untouched cheese or food on a table nearby. To most people, I think this would be a rather innocuous sight, especially compared to everything else around them. The underground is this vast, grandiose world filled with magic, stunning sights, and impossibly complex architecture. But surprisingly, Frisk doesn't focus on the insane world or situation they're in. Instead, they opt to focus on these simple little areas and end up ascribing a great deal of meaning to them, framing these areas with the mouse holes as an inspiring circumstance, hoping that the mouse might one day muster up the courage to come out from its home and get the cheese. While it's certainly not the craziest way to think about it, I still think that it's quite a thoughtful and meaningful way to interpret such a simple situation, especially considering how mundane and normal looking it is compared to the rest of the underground. One thing about them which is shrouded in mystery though is their home life. They seem to at least have a home to return back to based on their dialogue options with Toria when trying to leave the ruins, but if that household is a nice and loving one is dubious at best. Sure, they seem eager enough to get back home when talking to Toriel at the beginning of the game, but later on, they're perfectly fine with being adopted by the Dreamers. Not only at the end of the True Pacifist route do they give us the option to stay with Toriel, but there's another interaction with similar implications that's often overlooked. Before the end of True Pacifist, if you go back to Gerson, then you can get this unique dialogue about how Asgore never ages since he's a boss monster and his child is dead. After hearing this, Frisk on their own will then ask something along the lines of what would happen if Asgore's kid was a human, to which Gerson responds that he'd still age even if Asgore was their father. This interaction is so peculiar to me because while Frisk does have a couple of other implied responses throughout the game that we don't get to see, it's never anything nearly as detailed as what they ask about here. It is very vague, but the fact that Frisk asked about something so specific and how Gerson replies about Asgore being Frisk's father specifically makes this further potential evidence that Frisk wants to be adopted by Asgore, or at the very least, the Dreamers. I understand that by the end of the True Pacifist route, Frisk has made bonds with everyone which will last a lifetime. However, I still highly doubt that if they had a perfectly loving and caring family to go back to, that they'd even consider completely abandoning them without a word to move in with Toriel. The other option we're given isn't even necessarily about going back home, it's just that they have other places to go. Frisk loving the outdoors so much could even tie into this as a way to avoid their issues at home, but I think that steps a bit too far into conjecture for me. Heck, there's even the possibility that they don't really have a traditional home to return to and just live somewhere outside, based on these jokes they make about a kid sleeping in the soil. Whatever the case is, I think the fact that they'd even consider moving in with Toriel at the end of the game heavily suggests some degree of a troubled home life. Now, what we've been talking about up to this point has mainly just applied to what we see during the neutral and pacifist routes, but what about genocide? It's hard to believe that the same kid who appears to be a saint in pacifist can be the same person as the monster we see in the genocide route. However, one thing to consider is that no matter what the route is, Frisk is not a perfect child who can do no wrong. Aside from kinda just being rude with their fleeing dialogue, Frisk can also be extremely mean and even downright malicious to others. Remember that heckling dialogue with Snowdrake I talked about where Frisk tells them they can never be loved by anyone? Yeah, that's in the pacifist route. It doesn't stop there either. Frisk can insult others completely unprovoked like Vulcan, steal Icecap's hat and reduce them to just ice, straight up just eat a Vegetoid, let Monster Kid fall to their death, and the list goes on of borderline evil things they can do all in the pacifist route. There's also one moment that's possible in neutral routes which I think even rivals how evil Frisk is in Genocide. There's a bag of dog food that can be found in Alphys's lab, and normally interacting with it just gives you some flavor text simply describing it as such. However, if you've gone and killed every dog type of enemy in Snowdin and then interact with it, the narrator will add that Frisk remembers something funny. Keep in mind, you only have to kill all the dogs to get this to trigger, so this can happen in neutral routes and not just Genocide. Sure, killing those specific enemies is partly our choice as the player, but the fact that Frisk not only lacks any type of guilt over it, but goes as far as to find it humorous shows a capacity for evil almost on par with the Geno route. Well, alright, sure, they have the capacity to do some, bad stuff in other routes, to put it lightly, but going from that to Genocide still feels like a big jump. I mean, compared to that route, it's like putting the teacups against King Dakar. And honestly, I think that's fair. When it comes to the insane degree that their morals can differ in this route compared to others, it's extremely hard to ascertain, and is gonna be very ambiguous, especially compared to the other points I've talked about thus far. I spent a long time analyzing this route and trying to come up with one definitive conclusion about how and why Frisk acts the way they do, but after a long time thinking about it, I don't think there is any kind of undeniable end-all be-all explanation. At least not one that everyone would be satisfied with. So, instead of trying to give you that singular, flawless explanation, I want to offer a couple of the better interpretations of it and let you come to your own conclusions. A more by-the-books and baseline explanation of it is that Frisk gets corrupted in a way by the LV they gain by killing monsters, and loses themselves somewhere in the process. Sans tells us directly that the higher your level of violence is, the easier it is to distance yourself from others and inflict harm on them. This could then lead to Frisk losing their sense of self, as not only do they never say their own name like in Pacifist, but even unlike the neutral routes, the final mirror dialogue goes from "despite everything, it's still you" to "it's me, Kara," possibly implying a complete erasure of who Frisk once was. And for what it's worth, I think that this interpretation is pretty grounded and even mostly canon for the most part. Sans explicitly tells us about what LV does to someone, and the mirror implications are pretty solid as well. The shortcomings of this explanation on its own, though, are how much goes unanswered about Frisk, like why they even do it in the first place before the LV distances them from others. What reason could they possibly have to do something so cruel? One possible explanation for this, along with the giant variance in Frisk's morality in this route that I personally find really interesting, is that it's their sense of sentimentality, and that whatever the route is, they do care for the people in the underground a lot in one way or another. In Pacifists, this is pretty obvious, as the whole route is about making bonds with those around you and saving the world through those friendships. In Genocide, though, it's a bit different. It's easy to think that Frisk doesn't care about what they're doing, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. What really might be going on is a kind of perverted and warped sense of sentimentality and wanting to see what happens. Take, for example, exactly how Frisk skips over Papyrus's puzzles. At first, it's easy to watch these scenes and conclude that it's nothing more than Frisk skipping over the puzzles to get through with it as quickly as they can. But with the specific way in which they do it, it might actually be the opposite. If they want to get through it as fast as possible, you'd think that they would just immediately skip all the way to the end of every puzzle and maybe even try to rush at Papyrus and attack him early. But that isn't what they do. They don't attack him, but instead decide to walk halfway through his puzzles, stop, and wait to see his reaction. It's intentionally belittling him and his puzzles as much as possible, and comes off as trying to provoke and get a reaction out of him. And I don't think these movements are Kara taking control either. Not only is it extremely early in the route for something like that to happen in my opinion, but it's also just not in their character. Kara is straight to the point and uncaring, and probably wouldn't even let Papyrus get away after each puzzle. We can see this clearly at the end of the game where their influence is strong. They don't mess around the same way Frisk does. Kara doesn't let Asgore give his speech or even let him lead you to the barrier. They walk up to him, cut him off, and immediately hit him for 9,999 damage. Dealt with quickly and efficiently. By the end of the genocide route, Kara doesn't care about the monsters as people or anything else beyond EXP, and they certainly don't care about their reactions or how they feel. Frisk, though, is quite the opposite. Not only do they care about the monsters, but they seem to have this sadistic desire and take enjoyment from their suffering just as much as their happiness. While Kara finds value in seeing stats go up and maxing them out, Frisk finds it in seeing what will happen next. Again, a lot of that is just an interpretation of those events, but if it is true, then it serves as a really interesting mirror to the player and our own motivations as well. Just like Frisk, many of us choose to do the genocide route not because we don't care for these characters, but because of how much we do care for them. It's that exact same sick and twisted sense of sentimentality, but under a different context. For us, we kill monsters because we're invested in these characters and want to see what happens if we do. And because at the end of the day, they're game characters to us. We're detached from them because they aren't real and there's no consequences to doing it. Frisk, on the other hand, exists in-universe, but even though the monsters are real people to them, they end up sharing a lot of our same reasons for killing them. They not only kill to see what their reactions will be and what will happen, but with the power to turn back time and cheat death, it's possible that they start seeing the world as just as much of a game as we do. Although our circumstances are a little different, our motivations align and we both have the same end goal. Push the monsters and this game as far as we can and find out what happens. Our interactions with Sans in the final corridor highlight this especially well. Take this series of dialogue for example, where Sans reacts to us killing a single monster just to see what he'd say about it. Notice that he doesn't just infer this based on the player's actions alone though. He also explicitly mentions Frisk themselves having a certain look in their eye, indicating that they have just as much of a desire to see what happens as we do. Sans' final lines in his genocide fight sum it up best. Both us and Frisk do these things in the genocide route because we can do them, and if we can do them, then we have to. Not out of any desire for good or evil, but simply because we can, and we both want to see what comes next. I mentioned earlier that the definition of the word frisk was just to playfully hop around. And while that is true, it has another definition: to search. With all this having been said, I want to make it clear that I do think there is still ultimately a bit of ambiguity when it comes to Frisk's character. A large part of that for me is how we never get to see their exact reactions to a lot of important moments because they simply don't have any dialogue or any indication of how they feel after it. Like when they kill Undyne in Genocide, how do they feel about that? Do they respect Undyne as a fierce warrior who was able to give them a challenge? Or do they just see her as nothing more than another obstacle to overcome? Do they feel guilt seeing the parallels between her and themselves, realizing that Undyne is the hero they could have been? Do they even think about any of these things in the first place? With every other Undertale character, we're able to see their reactions to moments like these since we get direct and explicit dialogue from them. But even though we might be able to assume one thing or another about how Frisk reacts to certain situations, we ultimately can never never know for certain because of their unique role as the protagonist and the natural lack of dialogue that comes with it. I know I said earlier that Frisk isn't supposed to be that vague blank slate of a typical RPG hero, and I still stand by that. However, I think that Undertale still needs to follow that stereotype in some moments like these in order to successfully trick the player into thinking they do fall into that stereotype in the first place and subvert that trope at all. It would be way too obvious that Frisk is their own person from the get-go if we did get to see exactly what they thought at the end of every major encounter. So I think that this level of ambiguity is a necessary evil for that subversion of expectations to work at all. If there's one thing that is undeniable about Frisk though, it's their insane amount of strength. Because beyond a reasonable doubt, this kid is so absurdly strong to an almost unbelievable degree. We're talking about someone who can straight up just refuse death and face tank a laser beam from a god with their sheer willpower alone. Easily one of the coolest moments in this whole game for me is when Flowey has all 6 souls, outmatches Frisk on every metric, and Frisk takes a step toward him ready to throw down anyways. I don't care who you are, that is aura. That is pure goat status right there. What makes it all the more insane is that Frisk is literally just a kid. All the 6 other humans were also kids, but they weren't built like this. Somehow, Frisk was able to do what none of the other 6 could and make it through the whole underground. And it's all thanks to that signature trait, their unstoppable willpower, their determination. What I specifically love about Frisk the most though isn't just their strength, but how they're strong. They aren't always some beast at LV-19 who can erase the world, but they do always hold that mind-bogglingly immense amount of resolve. No matter the route, no matter what, they stay determined. But I don't like them just because of their willpower either. After all, there are tons of other characters in media like Spider-Man and Invincible that have that same conviction to never give up. What sets Frisk so far above and beyond these other protagonists for me is how we're linked together. Frisk and the player are a team, and just like how making decisions is a team effort between the two, the amount of willpower we both have is as well. Because at the end of the day, their determination is only as unrelenting as ours is. Frisk is our conduit into the world of Undertale. If they decide to give up, we can't continue either. We'd have nobody to experience the world through anymore. And it works similarly the other way around. If we give up and close the game forever, that's it. The implication is that in-universe, Frisk stays dead, and that's the end of the story. Our determination and Frisk's are diegetically tied together. It's physically impossible for their determination to exist without ours, and vice versa. It's because of this simple fact that I felt far more connected to Frisk than any other video game protagonist. It's why I think game overs and trying again in this game have always been so impactful to me. Because I know as hard as I push on to whatever goal it may be, Frisk is just as stubborn as I am. And let me tell you, if there's one thing that we know for absolute certain about this kid, it is that they are indomitable. Well, if you made it here, then sincerely thank you for listening to me rant about this little creature for this long. This video took a while because I really want to do Frisk's character justice along with the rest of their diehard fans as well. But other than that, I think I'm finally out of things to say, so I hope at the very least you found some of this interesting and, oh yeah, maybe subscribe or something, I don't know.